All right. Good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful day in November, the Saturday before Thanksgiving. We're so glad people are joining us. We have Carole Bucy here today, the Davidson County historian and a professor of history at Ball State for 26 years. So, Carole, what we typically do is you and I talk for a couple minutes as everybody gets on, and then we'll start in just a couple of minutes. So, are you doing okay this morning?
I'm well, very well, thank you. The sun is shining.
The sun is shining. It's going to be a great day for me to not go outside and work in the yard. I'm saying that for my wife's benefit. While we're waiting for a couple minutes, talk about the poster that's behind you. You were telling us about it.
Well, I'll be glad to. You may get a little bit of a glare, but this was done in 1993 when I got a grant from the Tennessee Humanities Council to do teacher workshops on how to infuse existing U.S. history with Tennessee women specifically. And, you know, U.S. history books 27 years ago had very few women. Betsy Ross, who was sewing, and Clara Barton wringing blood out of her skirt. So here we've got Cornelia Fort, famous airline pilot here. We've got various Civil War women. Here is Ida B. Wells, along with Mary Church Terrell, two African-American women from Tennessee who became national spokesmen for civil rights and women's rights. We've got the suffragists here and several pictures of them around. We've got Wilma Rudolph up here. I love this African-American nurse here with this brand newborn baby. You can't see it very well, but I'm going to scan these photos and put them up on a website somewhere so that you all can look at them, because in various things that have happened, some of these things have Metro can't find anymore. The ones from the two from the health department, Metro can't find. So I'm gonna work on that maybe during the Christmas holidays.
Good for you. Well, it is 10:03. Welcome everybody. I hope everybody has a wonderful and safe Thanksgiving. A couple of things before we start. New COVID numbers. We had 342 new cases since yesterday. That brings the total to 42,604. 3 additional deaths. Numbers are high. Be very, very careful over the holidays. You know that the mayor capped gatherings at 8 people. So, I know this is going to be a different Thanksgiving for everybody, but come up with clever ways to celebrate. I know we'll be Zooming in with our relatives, and we've already got some things lined up for the holidays to make it a little bit more fun. So I just encourage everybody to do that. And I know we have 2 council members on. Zach Young is on today, and Council Member Tanya Hancock is on today. So welcome, everybody. This is going to be really, really interesting. Carole Bucy, Davidson County historian, professor of history at Ball State. Welcome. I'm so glad you agreed to do this.
Thank you.
So the first question we always ask everybody is, tell us, for people who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you originally from Texas?
Yes, I'll give my disclaimer first. I am not a native, and so that does tend to bother some people more than others, but I came here in 1971 to graduate school and liked it so much that I never went back to Texas. So I've been here longer than I was in Texas, and it's been a wonderful place to live, to raise a family, and I can't imagine living anywhere else.
So where in Texas? Where in Texas were you?
I grew up in a small town on the Red River between Sherman and Paris, Texas, the Oklahoma border, called Bonham. Bonham's only claim to fame throughout history was that our congressman, and I happened to be lucky enough to be a child when he was our congressman, was Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House.
Oh, okay.
And my grandmother adored Mr. Sam because it was Mr. Sam and Franklin Roosevelt who saved them from old Hoover. And so she talked about that to her dying day. Old Hoover wiped us out. They were farmers and lost their farm.
So for people who don't know who Old Hoover is, you're talking about Herbert Hoover, the
Yes,
president.
I'm talking about Herbert Hoover, whom my grandmother personally blamed for the bank in Petty, Texas foreclosing on their farm.
All right. Did she tell him that? Did she send him a message, or she just
Well,
personally?
I doubt that she did, but she never ceased talking about it. She loved politics. She adored politics. And she did not vote until 1920. She was 39 years old in 1920 and went to the Methodist Church in Petty and voted for the first time because of something that happened in Nashville, Tennessee. And along with her, my grandfather carried her to the church to vote. He went in and voted too, but along with her in her hand was my mother, who was 4 years old. She remembered it until the day she died.
How very, very interesting. All right. So did you always love history? Is that something that your mom taught you? Is that just something, or is that just something that happened along the way?
Well, actually, everybody in my family except me was a musician. And my mother taught music. My father loved to sing. My brother was a very, very fine pianist. He was the pianist for the New York City Ballet. He died of AIDS in that big first wave of AIDS in New York City in the early 1980s. Well, I guess late 1980s. And so everybody was a musician, but there was my grandmother who lived in our house when I was growing up. My grandfather had died, and she loved watching those Democratic and Republican conventions on television. So then she would go off on this spiel about who these people were and which ones she liked and didn't like. But we also did something that I bet a lot of your listeners did when they were children that we never do now, which is we went to the cemetery where our family was buried in Honey Grove, Texas, regularly at holidays, Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays. We went to that cemetery and carried flowers. And my grandmother, who loved to tell stories, she had a story for every one of our kin. And that included my father's family, her son-in-law's family as well.
Yeah, I think my wife has stories about everybody in my family that will carry on for a long time. So when you came to school, did you go to Vanderbilt?
I came to Peabody. I was
Peabody.
always interested in being a teacher, and I was lucky enough to study with Dr. Jack Allen at Peabody and Dr. Dewey Grantham, at Vanderbilt, who oversaw my master's thesis. There was really no women's history in those days, and so my master's thesis was about Hugo Black's appointment to the Supreme Court by Franklin Roosevelt.
Interesting.
A forgettable piece of work.
Well, I haven't read that, but maybe I'll go see if I can find it. Okay, I'll just come over to your house and
research. It'll start research.
I'll search it. Okay. So, how did you, after that, how did you kind of morph into, first of all, becoming a professor of history, but second of all, eventually becoming the historian, the Davidson County historian?
All right, there are 30 years between the year I got my master's degree and the year I got my PhD, 1972 and 2002. And so there are 30 years in between. And I was a stay-at-home mother, but I was always very involved in things. And I taught a retired women's Sunday school class at Westminster Presbyterian Church. It had some retired principals in it, and they encouraged me to teach. The Millspaw sisters, Catherine and Margaret, they really encouraged me. I was not really ready for the things that some of my friends were involved in, and so I joined the League of Women Voters. And, you know, I've been very fortunate to have women throughout my life who really shepherded me along. And there were some really marvelous women in the League of Women Voters in the late 70s and early 80s who took me under their wing. And we thought we were saving the world, certainly saving Nashville, because the League was very active. We opposed certain amendments to the charter and supported certain amendments to the Metro Charter. And so one thing that happened during that period of time was I got very interested in the history of the Metro Charter, primarily because my husband worked for lawyer Carmack Cochran when he got out of law school. He worked in that law firm, and Carmack Cochran was the chair of both the first and the second charter commissions. And so I adored Carmack Cochran, and he passed away, I guess, in 1978. And so I was very interested in the history of the charter because of that. And so, you know, then I got to be big buddies with Cecil Branstetter, who was chair of the Metro Charter Revision Commission, and Phil Bredesen appointed me to that commission. So I had a lot of help and encouragement in those days. But the one thing that really woke me up to history was going out to the city cemetery with my children as a field trip driver when they were in elementary school. There was an elderly woman named Gladys Hamilton who gave the tour. She died when my son finished 4th grade. And I was mesmerized by all the stories that Gladys Hamilton had to tell out there in the cemetery. They were fascinating, and I knew none of them. I knew nothing about James Robertson, everybody else out there. And 75% of the people out there are women and children. So I volunteered to start doing the cemetery tours. And that's where you and I first met, actually, Jim, on the Save the Cemetery board. And so, you know, that got me back into history.
It was the city cemetery, if people have not been out there. And I think you can go out there. I don't know if they may close the gates at night, but they open them back up. But particularly, and this was obviously an off year, but I know the City Cemetery Association does tours around in the fall. And what they would do is they have people that go out there and represent the people who are actually in the graves. So you learn about the history of these individuals. So real quick, and then we're going to get into the 1918 pandemic. But for people who have never been to the city cemetery, tell us who's out there. Who is out there in there?
Well, they think that 75% of the people are women and children. Women died in childbirth, and children, this is a good segue over to the epidemics, because children died in epidemics. And it is the best dose of history you'll ever get. If you go to the city cemetery, that's Nashville history of all races and ethnicities and religious groups up to the Civil War, very diverse, and you will see all manner of stories. And then you go to Mount Ararat, the African-American cemetery, which is next to the more modern African-American cemetery, Greenwood, which is out on Elm Hill Pike. It used to be adjacent to the Calvary Cemetery, which is the Nashville's Catholic cemetery, which is next door to Mount Olivet Cemetery. Yep. And then if you go up just a block or two north of Fisk, you'll see the Temple Cemetery. And I guess there are 2 or 3 cemeteries there that are backed up of various Jewish congregations. So if you go to these cemeteries and take a tour, you will learn Nashville history better and more pleasurable than any books you might read.
So I forget, so the founders of Nashville are buried out there, correct? Out in the city cemetery, which is at the corner of 4th and, I forget the cross street. But if you get off the interstate and head, I guess, south on 4th, it's just up here on the right. You can see it. You drive, you know, people drive by it all the time.
Yeah.
But the founding fathers are located in there. Is that right?
James K. Polk, James Robertson and Charlotte Robertson are buried there. There are all manner of early people. One of the Ewings, who was the first secretary of the Cumberland area and clerk of Nashville. There are all manner of people, like U.S. senators are buried out there, people who were artists. We have some Confederate generals out there that get a lot of attention from time to time. And everybody out there has a story. Now, some of them are more intriguing perhaps than others, But you walk around there, we have two of the original Fisk Jubilee singers out there. We have a early Nashville history is a walk through that cemetery.
So there was a story that I always heard when I went out there that there were hidden tunnels that somehow connected the city cemetery to, I'm not sure where. There was talk about during the Civil War that they had been tunnels and that people had tunneled through and come out through graves. Is there any...
The story I heard was they came out through Fort Negley. No, it was the other way around. Now, this is the story, and we're getting way off base here, but I'll be quick.
That's okay.
There were these Confederate soldiers, young men, and of course, we all know that the way history was taught was the Confederates were brilliant and the Yankees were not very smart at all. So these Confederates were held in prison up there at Fort Negley, and they decided to escape, and they dug a tunnel and came out in the city cemetery and popped right out of John McNairy's vault. Now that's if you watch any digging going on in Nashville, and there's plenty of opportunities to watch digging, you see that Nashville sits on a bed of limestone in this Cumberland Basin, which is like a soup bowl. And you cannot dig a tunnel from Fort Negley. It is physically impossible. Even if you were Superman, you could not do that, or Wonder Woman. She could probably do it, but I know Superman couldn't do this. So
right.
anyway, what they did find out 10 years ago maybe, in doing some renovation, they opened the vault. And sure enough, there are some tunnels back in there, caves more or less, really not tunnels, really caves. And one of my colleagues at Vol State found a newspaper article from the late 1860s where there were some robbers who stole jewelry from people in Nashville and hid their loot in John McNairy's vault.
Interesting. Well, people, if you haven't gone out to the city cemetery, you should. It's very, very interesting. Okay, so we're somewhere in the middle, somewhere maybe we're closer to the end. Who knows? We're in this pandemic. Okay, let's hope we're closer to the end, but obviously we don't know yet. Tell people what you know about what happened in 1918 in Nashville with the pandemic, the last major pandemic, I guess, that we would say in this country, with the Spanish flu. How much do you know about it, and what happened in Nashville?
Well, I know a fair amount about what happened in Nashville in 1918. At the time, it was by far the worst epidemic this city had seen. In retrospect, it is nothing. Today's COVID-19 is nothing like the Spanish flu, because the Spanish flu only really lasted a very short period of time. And I have been back through the old newspapers about this, and you don't really even see it popping up in the newspapers until September of 1918. It had come from Europe to a military base in Kansas. We're in the middle of World War I. The United States did not enter the war until April of 1917. So our men did not get over to Europe really until the fall. And so then when they started coming home, this flu got brought to a military base. It was spread by train, first to Philadelphia, and then because Nashville was a railroad center, it got to Nashville very quickly. But it didn't last very long. And the thing we have to remember about Nashville today and Nashville in 1918 is Nashville in 1918 was confined to the relatively small geographic area from the Gulch to the Cumberland River, and then we could talk about East Nashville across the river, but it was a geographically small area, and people weren't spread out so much, and they didn't travel so much. Some people, a few people in 1918 might have had a car, but not very many, and people walked pretty much everywhere they went, and they weren't really confined. So it wasn't until October that it really sort of started spiking. And then when it did, the Board of Aldermen and the mayor asked people to close the churches. They closed the movie theaters, but it was for 2 weeks. And then it abated, it came back. Now, one important thing is we learned from that is that people living in close quarters, dormitories, or military barracks are exposed to disease far more than people living with a single family. And where the epidemic really exploded was at the Old Hickory powder plant. DuPont had gotten a contract to make gunpowder and built a plant in Old Hickory, what is now Old Hickory. And the workers out there, who were predominantly women, there was a good population of Hispanic workers out there who had come to Tennessee specifically to take those jobs. They lived in what amounted to barracks. The YMCA and the YWCA had provided pretty much makeshift barracks. And so that's where the epidemic really exploded. And that's where the most deaths in town were. Nashville was not immune to epidemics. We had had epidemics since the very beginning. James K. Polk died in an epidemic of cholera in 1849. Cholera was a common epidemic, and people didn't know what spread cholera. They thought that it was spread by germs, but indeed, it really was a matter of public health and sanitation, because when we had a lot of rain in the spring, the water table would rise. And as the water table rose, people got sick. And then they couldn't figure out what was making them sick. So they blamed it on the dead at the Nashville City Cemetery for a while. But anyway.
So they blamed it on the dead. So
yeah, they thought that it was being transmitted by corpses. And the city cemetery had this holding vault where if you died in the winter, your body was left in this vault until the ground softened in the spring so that a grave could be dug. But yes, and so, they kept thinking it was spread by contact with other people or with corpses. And so in 1870s, they closed the cemetery for a while because of an epidemic of diphtheria. And there were a lot of people in Nashville who wanted to completely destroy the city cemetery. And the Board of Aldermen did vote to destroy this holding vault. But the epidemics were not new, but this one was bigger and more widespread. And the fact that so many young people died in this epidemic really terrified people in Nashville.
So what happened? I guess 2 questions. One is, it sounds like the mayor and the Board of Aldermen shut the city down for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Can you tell whether that did anything, or, and then I guess the second part would be, how did it eventually end? Because I'm not even sure how we ran this thing out. I knew that there was, I think, a second spike in the winter.
In 1919, there in the spring, there was a second spike. One thing that I don't think had anything to do with whether it spread or diminished, but because we were so close to winning World War I, and everybody needed, in the eyes of the leaders of the city and the state and the country, needed to be focused on winning the war and not health issues so much. You didn't see a tremendous amount in the newspapers. It was the war that always were the headlines of the Tennesseans. And I don't think that really had anything to do with whether it spread or not, but we were more focused on the war. But people weren't congregating as much in 1918 as we have been in the habit of doing in more recent times. And I think it's that congregating that really what has spread it so much.
So there was no pedal taverns back in the 19th.
Oh, no pedal taverns.
There have been pedals, but not the same type of thing. Okay.
A few bicycles, yes, but that was about it.
Interesting. All right. So, all right. So let's switch over to, let's move up a little bit to, well, so before I get to civil rights, women's suffrage, obviously 100th anniversary. such a big deal. I know a lot of stuff has been played up with it. Mr. Representative Burns, voting because his mother asked him to. I mean, it's a big deal for Tennessee. I know a lot of stuff has been covered this year. Anything else that you would want to add, just to, because despite the fact that 2020 has been such a horrible year for so many people, it was the 100th anniversary, and that was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a big deal, and it still is a big deal. And I don't want to get too political here, but the fact we've got a woman vice president-elect right now, in large part because of women getting more active in politics, that really kind of got going here in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I think it truly is a big deal. If any of you take the New Yorker magazine, just look at the cover of it for this week, and it will make you women for sure, and some of you men tear up. It's called Election Results, and I will only say that you should look at that cover. It says everything about what this ratification of the 19th Amendment really means to not just us. It was a big deal. And, I will admit that I was really kind of disappointed with the way things played out, because I'd worked a lot for the past year or so on the new Votes for Women room at the Nashville Public Library, and we didn't get to have a big grand opening like had been expected. I had worked on the State Museum exhibit, and the State Museum is open, and I think that exhibit's going to close in January. So if you haven't been down there and seen that, you really ought to go before it closes. But the Civil Rights Room, the thing about that, the Women's Rights Room, Votes for Women room, is that it is going to be there. And your grandchildren, even if you're 25 years old, your grandchildren will be able to go in and learn about what happened. And when I came here in 1971, I did not hear one word about this story, not one word. I didn't even know about it until the kind of late 1880s, where another one of these women who took me under her arm and said, Carole, you've got to get back into history, Elizabeth Perry, who was teaching at Vanderbilt, took me downtown to hear a radio broadcast that was a dramatization. Candace Corrigan, a musician, had done this radio show, radio drama for Michigan Public Radio, and she was putting it on live at the Hermitage Hotel. I'd never heard the story. I was totally mesmerized by the story that this happened, and nobody had told me this. Or perhaps the better way to say it is nobody had informed me of this, because there were no suffragists buried at the Nashville City Cemetery. And so anyway, I started doing research on that, and I have loved every minute of everything I did. Having said that, I was really, when I got up on August the 18th, I was kind of ho-hum. I got these various things to do, but I'm going to get through the day. And I have to say, I was so surprised. And from the get-go, when I was over at the Parthenon for the permanent celebration of the suffrage statue in Centennial Park, from the get-go, when these women, this airplane starts circling around and getting a little bit lower, and then way over here, one at a time, these women skydivers started jumping out of that plane. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my eyes welling up with tears. I mean, watching these women come one at a time out of that plane, it was like ballet, and their movements were so smooth and beautiful, and they had these big Votes for Women banners that just, the wind was at the right position, and it was a photographer's heyday. And from that point forward, the day was pretty exciting. The bell ringing, there was no bell ringing in 1920 when the suffrage amendment was ratified, because the antis were determined to get it unratified. And even after, I bet you didn't know this, Jim, even after Governor Roberts signed it, even after the Secretary of State of the United States, Bainbridge Coleridge, even after he signed it, and it was all part of the Constitution, they were still trying to get it undone. You know, I think Seth Walker himself, the Speaker of the House, went to Washington and tried to meet with Colby about how they could undo it. That he had changed horses in midstream, and he had constitutional reasons. So, you know, I was mesmerized. And let me tell you one last thing that happened that night.
Mm-hmm.
We go to the Hermitage Hotel, and there's a dinner in the lobby, and Elaine Weiss and Trevania Dudley Henderson and Alice Dudley's daughter, who were supposed to be live, were on big television screens, and I was in the middle asking them questions. And it was a lovely evening, but I was waiting up in the balcony because I don't like to eat, the veranda is what I like to call it, of the Hermitage. I don't like to eat before I speak. And there were all these camera people buzzing around, and I couldn't figure out, well, why are you here just to film this? Well, after the event was over, I learned that there was this group of young women, all were delegates to the Democratic National Convention, and they had decided they were going to do their voting that night. It was the night that the vote took place at the convention. They were going to do it from the Hermitage Hotel. And imagine they're up there on the balcony after the festivities of the dinner are over, and in the backdrop, on the day of the anniversary, they're casting their vote at a Democratic convention. Pretty amazing.
That is very, very amazing, and very great that they did that. Let me ask you one other question, because I think this is so interesting. So, you know, I'm downtown all the time, but there's nobody down there right now. You know, it's very quiet. But so the Hermitage Hotel. So if you know, if we meet visitors, which we eventually will have more of coming back into Nashville, who are interested in history and just want to say, hey, that's where you should go just to be a part of something, would you send them to the Hermitage Hotel? Is that the place to send them?
Well,
I'd like
you'd send them first to the Vote for Women room, so that they would understand the story. The Hermitage Hotel is absolutely a treasure. And on the subject of historic preservation, it was saved from the wrecking ball. But the Hermitage Hotel it's magnificent. Just sit in that lobby and you just feel so taken back in time. It's wonderful. It's such a beautiful place. But out of context, it's just another beautiful hotel that's been restored and preserved. But you've got to understand what was going on with the antis on one floor and the pro-suffrage people on another floor, and the antis had put up this museum exhibit that was just filled with anti-racial materials, and you can just think of all those people with their cigars in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel. You got to know the story before it will mean anything to you. Now, having said that, I hope this doesn't sound like self-promotion, but the Metro Historical Commission has been a sort of a co-sponsor for this Nashville Sites walking tour app. And I did the Suffrage Tour for that program, and it takes it's free, it's web-based. You just go onto your phone, and it's got there are all sorts of things on it. After you get on the Nashville Sites website, you'll see what tours you have to take. But take the Suffrage Tour, and it'll walk you through a lot of the major sites. It starts at Union Station, goes to Christ Episcopal, Hume Fogg, and then around to, among other things, the old Satsuma restaurant. Some of you will remember Satsuma, and ends at the Hermitage Hotel.
So does it actually take you, because this is what I heard when Representative Burns cast that deciding vote, at some point he had to sneak outside of the Capitol. He had to go outside he had to climb outside the window and go around.
That's is, let us just say, that is folklore. We don't have any camera evidence of this happening. That was told over and over again. He spoke about why he had changed his vote and what the reasons for doing it. But that was the story I heard the first time I ever heard the story, that he climbed out a window and walked down to the windows of the State Library, which was in the Capitol building at that time. And Mrs. John Trotwood Moore, it took me about 5 years to find out that she actually had a first name, Mary Daniels Moore, hit him in the stacks. That's all legend. That's the thing about history. You know, some of it's true, and the legends have a life of their own. But that doesn't diminish what Harry Byrne did, because the antis were angry with him. They were also angry at Banks Turner. And I really want to call your viewers' attention to Banks Turner, because he and Joe Hanover have really not gotten nearly enough credit for their part in making ratification take place. There's an article coming out in about 3 months in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly about Banks Turner, who was from Trenton, Tennessee, who cast a vote not to table the amendment that kept it alive so that Harry Byrne could cast his vote. Joe Hanover was the Democratic floor leader, even after Seth Walker defected. He was from Memphis. He had been born in Russia or Eastern Europe. His parents had escaped to Russia during a pogrom, to Memphis during a pogrom. He could not understand when he got to the United States why his mother couldn't vote. So there's a lovely biography of him written by Bill Houghton, who lives in Jackson, about Joe Hanover, which is both and Harry Byrne. There's a biography about him as well. So you've got an article in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly about Banks Turner in these two books. But there are a lot of women in this story that we still have got to find more about. You know, I've saved for about 2 years this folder where every time I see a list of women that are going to a suffrage meeting, I just stick them in there. And sometime when I'm really have some time, I'll try to put these on an Excel sheet and see what we can dig out about all these women who supported suffrage.
All right, so let's switch over to civil rights.
Right.
Obviously, a lot of interesting things happening this year. And I think we'll continue to move forward, but particularly in terms of like the Black Lives Matters issues. But take us back to, I guess, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s in terms of the civil rights movement in Nashville. And tell people who don't know, particularly, I mean, because obviously John Lewis passed away this year, a major player in the civil rights movement, especially here. Tell us what you know about that, particularly where it happened and all the different factors that came into play to making Nashville a major player in all this.
I think that Nashville was the perfect city for this sit-ins movement to really take off and take place, and why it could happen in Nashville and not a lot of other towns in the South, I think is worth noting. Nashville before the Civil War had a small but very significant population of free blacks. James Napier's parents were free blacks. They had started a school for these free black children that lived in Nashville because there were no educational opportunities for them here. And this small population became the elite African Americans after the Civil War, who started the African American business community, the publishing house. They were very active in all of the churches. And so Nashville's African Americans, during the worst of Jim Crow segregation, Nashville's African Americans could in fact vote, at least the men. And they did vote. Now, of course, one of the things when the ex-Confederates returned to power and amended the state constitution, they made it very difficult for African Americans or poor people to vote, and we had a state poll tax for a long time. You had to pay money to be able to register to vote. But Nashville had this middle class of African Americans who did vote regularly. We had African Americans in the city council. James Napier became the treasurer of the United States under Woodrow Wilson, but no, under William Howard Taft. But when Woodrow Wilson became president and decided to segregate Washington, D.C., James Napier resigned from his position in the U.S. Treasury on the grounds that he was not going to be segregated. And, you know, that story is largely forgotten. The Nashville business community had led a streetcar strike. There's all sorts of things that were out there to make the sit-ins possible. Things just don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because of things that have happened before that people have always forgotten. And so here you've got these two universities as well, Fisk University and Tennessee State, and they have first-rate faculties. Both of those schools do. And so you've got those schools, the ministers in the African American churches, and these business leaders providing a perfect place to test segregation. And so, in fact, they start the sit-ins. James Lawson, who was he was a student to be a Methodist minister, an African-American Episcopal AME minister. He was in the divinity school at Vanderbilt University. He had studied the techniques of Mahatma Gandhi and began running these workshops in the basement of the First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, which was where the Snodgrass building is today. And they were prepared. He did an excellent job. He had the support and help of Reverend Kelly Miller Smith, truly a person in Nashville history who deserves a tremendous amount of credit for all of this working as smoothly as it did. And so here we have the sit-ins being planned. Now, they did take place. Yes, there were sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina 2 weeks before our sit-ins, but theirs were more what I would call a wildcat sit-in. These students just said, hey, let's go see what we can do. And there was no training or anything. The Nashville students were highly trained. You can go on YouTube and watch Ain't Scared of Your Jails, which is part of a old, I guess it was an NBC white paper maybe, that became a civil rights documentary that public television did many years ago. But it Ain't Scared of Your Jails, and watch that about the sit-ins. It's remarkable to see what they did and how they were treated. I mean, you will see what happened there very graphically when the Bubbas of Nashville come in and decide they're going to break up the sit-ins. But these students were incredibly courageous in what they did. And we have every reason to be proud of that story. And I think that's one thing that's so wonderful about our public library system that makes us unique from others. We are anchored now on the second floor by the Civil Rights Room on one end and the Votes for Women room on the other end. And it is a great testament to the people who have pushed for these things, that we have these living memorials to all of these things that have taken place. You know, I've heard James Lawson speak in John Lewis, and John Lewis said several times that, you know, they really felt like they were on a holy crusade. They felt like they were going to die. And it was quite a thing to think that these students were willing to die, which they thought it was going to take to change this country's mind. And I do hope that some good will come out of the George Floyd murder, because we saw on television how he died. And I hope that that will cause us to think about how African Americans are treated differently, even in 2020, from white people who may break the law. And I hope that some good will come from that. But the sit-ins are a remarkable part of our history. The Woolworths downtown has been really remarkably well renovated. There are a lot of pictures and things down there that portray that story of the sit-ins. And we should be proud of Nashville for what it did and for what it didn't do, and Mayor Ben West.
So let me ask you just an overall question. Nashville has so much history to it. I mean, you've talked today about all these interesting things, but sometimes, particularly as Nashville grows, and we have all these new buildings coming up and all these people living downtown and all this stuff going on all at the same time. How do we preserve that history? How do we hold on to that? And obviously we have the library and, the information there, but some of this stuff is so fascinating. And I would bet that most of the people who walk around downtown have no idea the historical things that happen right where they're standing.
Oh, they don't. And we've got the Nashville Sites tours, but that's it. Now, I had an idea a few years ago, and as my husband would say, she has these ideas whose time has not yet come.
Right. So, what's the idea? And you may have told me. What is it?
Oh, I don't think I have, actually. The Customs House is really an architectural wonder. It is truly magnificent. When the Kefauver building was built, the federal government, in an exchange, it's a longer story than you all want to hear, but it became the property of Metro. Metro then leased it to a leaseor, I guess is what I would call it. It's leased now. And the building, as I understand it, is about half occupied. I've made several attempts over the years to contact whoever runs it, and I've never gotten a call back. But it was my idea that building somehow go back to Metro, and we put a museum on the first floor that is Nashville history. Other cities have museums, and Paul Clement, he's a native Nashvilleian and historian of early Nashville. He has floated this idea long before I did. And my idea was to take the first floor of the Customs House, so we don't have to build a building, and turn that into the City of Nashville Museum. We've definitely got enough history to fill it up. And some people think it's a bad idea. Some people think it's a good idea. But the other side of that is that building is not in really good shape, the exception being the courtrooms and the judges' chambers. And the judges who are up there don't really want to move to another building. They're quite happy with their quarters and their courtroom up there, and they're magnificently restored, but everything else is looking pretty dilapidated, especially you go in from that parking lot on the back. Mm-hmm. It really is not an inviting place, but it's right on the walking line of lots of people.
All right, well, I wrote it down, so that'll go on the list of things to start looking at. So talk about, I used to think, particularly walking around the state capitol. So my idea, and I had actually talked to Senator Douglas Henry at some point about this, and they actually finally did something. But if you come through the Calhoun Tunnel from Charlotte Avenue and walk all the way down, for years it was just the plain tunnel. And I always thought, you should take advantage of the fact that all those kids, the school kids and everything else, are usually let off at that tunnel, and then they go walk into the Capitol. You should put up the 12 most historic things that happened in Tennessee, and it could always change, but make it into a history tunnel. And they actually now have diagrams of the state capitol, I think, architectural diagrams.
They have some old photographs up there too on the tunnel. Well, I think that that's an excellent idea. I've also suggested that at the Nashville airport, because I think I was in the Atlanta airport maybe a few years ago, and they had a big history exhibit up kind of right in the middle of where the walkways were going. And I've suggested that we put Nashville history all along the walls of that. The Music City Center is another place where we could have, nothing. I mean, it would just be flat museum panels with images and not really even having artifacts. But I think that we've got such a rich cultural community here that we've got first-rate artists who could design these panels. And I think, the more people see this, the more it will finally sink in. You have to be kind of exposed. I hate to use that word right now, but you have to be exposed to history a few times before you catch the disease, so to speak. And so I would love to see the airport, the tunnel, the Music City Center. I would love to see panels of Nashville history. And I think it's really, that is cheap. Now, doing a museum would be quite expensive, but doing panels of history, I think that's very inexpensive.
So let me ask you this. Who has all this stuff? So, one of the questions that we got was the status of the State Museum. And obviously they're building a new library and archives down, and they've got a brand new State Museum. And lots of people go to the State Museum. It's very well done. But in the old museum, which was, in the basement of the Polk building, there were all kinds of things down there. And there was a room hidden behind where they had all kinds of very, very unique stuff. So the question here is, who's got all the Metro stuff?
All right, the State Museum has a whole lot of it. And let me tell you about the State Museum. After that little water problem with the redesign of TPAC and the museum was flooded, supposedly that was the worst museum calamity in U.S. history. That was said by the people who came in to examine it and say, oh my gosh, we don't need a museum in a basement. We do not need a museum in a basement. Now, the state of Tennessee is going to take over that space. Right now, there is a good number of staff still in the museum staff who are still there, and all of their permanent collection is in that big area that you saw, Jim, behind there. The plan is that they're going to rehab some parts, and I can't really envision this because I haven't been out there. The old main prison, which is on the Nashville 9 endangered species list this year that was announced, I guess, maybe Thursday. But they're going to rehab that space, and the storage for the museum collection will be out there at that spot. They've got tremendous amount of artwork that is not out. I mean, there's actually relatively little of their collection that is out. And so they're going to move that. The long range plan, as I have been told, is going to be moved out there, and the curators will be out there with that. They don't have enough offices at the new museum for everybody to be on site, and they have really no storage area there either. So supposedly all of the collection, which is still there, is going to be transferred to the old prison. We'll see if that takes place. It's, the new museum's been open, what, 2 years now?
Yeah.
And so they're still not out of the Polk building.
Where is Nashville stuff?
They've got Nashville stuff. They've got a lot of stuff about Nashville history. Because,
right, but do they have it all, or do we have some of it someplace else, like with our Metro Archives?
Well, the Metro Archives has some things, yes, the Metro Archive, but not they are more paper than material culture.
Okay.
And I mean, I think they've got a big collection of neon lights, among other things. And we do have some things, and yet much of the stuff is with the state archives,
Okay.
and the state museum.
All right. So we have about 5 minutes left. All right. So I'm going to put you. Well, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. All right, in the last 5 minutes. That one is, if you could tell people, give me an historic event that, not the civil rights, we've talked about that, or the women's suffrage, or the pandemic, something that most people don't know about that really was significant in Nashville history, that you would say, hey, you probably didn't know this, but you should. What would that be?
I think that it would be the fact that Nashville was this transportation hub for this whole region, simply because a steamboat could get up the Cumberland to Nashville pretty easily. And so Nashville became this transportation center, and consequently it became a banking center. And so Nashville had a strong business community, but Nashville also had a lot of people moving in early that came from different parts of the country, meaning the Northeast, who stayed here and made this a richer place. And, you know, one of the people that comes to mind is Francis Fogg, who came here from Massachusetts, Connecticut, became a lawyer, became very involved in Nashville local affairs. He married one of the Rutledge daughters, and he was very active in a lot of things here. He was against slavery. Nashville had a significant population of people who opposed slavery. Now, Nashville also had a significant population of people who opposed Andrew Jackson, which may surprise you. Nashville became known from about 1830 to the Civil War as Whig City. The Whigs were a political party that came up of people who were opposed to Andrew Jackson because he had closed the Bank of the United States, or killed it, I guess would be a better way to say that. And the Whig Party was very, very strong. You look at the list of Nashville mayors and look at how many Whigs were elected mayor of Nashville. And so you also, 2 people that I think need to be kind of singled out here are the Lensleys who came. Philip Lenslee came to Nashville to be the president of the University of Nashville. The city wanted this university brought to life, and so they brought in Philip Lenslee, who some say was considered to be one of the best educators in the country. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister, and he was also a professor. And he came in 1824 to rejuvenate this college that was pretty much defunct. And that produced doctors, it produced all manner of educated people. And so education was always really, really important to the people who led this city. And it's why that this university was really, the University of Nashville really did a great deal of good for this city. And I think that's been forgotten. And the whole thing of the fact that we had these outsiders coming in, it made our city a healthier place. We weren't so insular. We were open to ideas, and I would like to think Nashville is still very much that way today.
All right. So last question, and before I get to that, I remind everybody we are not on next week. We're giving everybody Thanksgiving break off. Be safe. Matt Wilshire from MDHA is going to be our guest the following Saturday, and they've had some changes over there, so stay tuned to that. Last question. See if you can get this one. Because I've asked several people this.
This is Stump the Chump now.
Yeah.
Stump the Chump.
So the Metropolitan Symbol has a different things on it, but it basically has a Native American holding a skull. How did we, what's the story behind that? Do you know? I've heard different things, but do you know what the story is?
I know a little bit about it, and I can write you pretty much a nice little paper about that and send it to you, because I have done a lot of research on it. There's a lot of different ideas about what that skull means, but keep in mind, if you go walk in any of the old New England pre-Revolutionary War cemeteries, you'll see the skull and crossbones on a lot of headstones in very old pre-Revolutionary cemeteries. And so the skull, this kind of idea is life is fragile, is one of the symbols that skull represents. And so it certainly was not done as enlightened people wanting to do something to forgive how we had treated the Indians. There's a lot of different discussions there. You can look some of this up on the internet, and a lot of people have thought it was a Cherokee warrior, Oconostota, but I think, I would have to look this up to be sure about this, but I think Oconostota was already dead before Nashville was founded. I think that it's probably more likely the Chickasaws were in West Tennessee, chieftain Piamingo, who did come in and out of here several times after James Robertson, Charlotte Robertson, John Donaldson, Rachel Donaldson, before the founders of the city. Yeah. Here, and he negotiated with Robertson a good bit of time. There's a tree out in West Nashville called Treaty Oak. So that is, I think it's more likely Piamingo than Oconostota, but everything on there, you know, the compass points were added. They redid the seal. Supposedly they hired a committee, a designer, to do the seal of Metro in 1963 when the Metro became the consolidated government. Mm-hmm. And all they did was take the seal of the city of Nashville and put the compass points around it. They didn't do much else to the seal.
Well, I know we're past time. This has been fascinating, and I'm getting all kinds of stuff on the chat box, and now we're out of time. Carole Bucy, thank you for being our guest. Some of these people who are sending chat messages, we'll try to hold on to, and then you can probably respond to them. And I think we may have to invite you back, because I got all kinds of more questions to ask you, but this was kind of, we thought this might be fun right before Thanksgiving as a treat. And it really has been. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Everybody, yeah, I'm saying invite her back, have her back. Okay, so we're going to get you to come back. Thank you. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Be safe. Everyone be safe. Have a great Thanksgiving. We'll see you back here in a couple of weeks with Matt Wilshire. Thank you all for joining in. Thanks, Carole.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.